I believe that marriage is between a man and a woman. But I also detest the sort of bashing and vilifying of gays and lesbians because I think it's unduly divisive. It's unnecessary. Most gays and lesbians are simply seeking basic recognition of their rights so that they're not discriminated against in employment, that they're not discriminated against with respect to renting a house, that they are able to visit their partner in a hospital, that they can transfer property. Those, I think, are, in the words of Vice President Cheney, rights for everybody, not just for some people. We've got to make sure that everybody is equal under the law. And the civil unions that I proposed would be equivalent in terms of making sure that all the rights that are conferred by the state are equal for same-sex couples as well as for heterosexual couples. Now, with respect to marriage, it's my belief that it's up to the individual denominations to make a decision as to whether they want to recognize marriage or not. But in terms of, the rights of people to transfer property, to have hospital visitation, all those critical civil rights that are conferred by our government, those should be equal. With respect to gay marriage, I do not support gay marriage, but I support a very strong version of civil unions where I think the state has to recognize the same rights and responsibilities for gay people, same-sex couples, as they do for anybody else. Because the state is not a religious institution, and I believe in equal protection under the law, and so making sure that the right to transfer property, hospital visitation, non-discrimination, all those principles apply to same-sex couples, I think is important. And I do think that individual denominations can then make a decision as to whether, from a religious perspective, they want to recognize a same-sex couple in a marriage.
Define marriage.
I believe that marriage is the union between a man and a woman. Now, for me as a Christian, it's also a sacred union. God's in the mix.
Would you support a constitutional amendment with that definition?
No, I would not.
Why not?
And because historically we have not defined marriage in our Constitution. It's been a matter of state law. That has been our tradition. I am not somebody who promotes same-sex marriage, but I do believe in civil unions. I do believe that we should not, that for gay partners to want to visit each other in a hospital, for the state to say, you know what, that's all right. I don't think in any way inhibits my core beliefs about what marriage are. I think my faith is strong enough and my marriage is strong enough that I can afford those civil rights to others.
And I believed that discrimination because of somebody's sexual orientation or gender identity ran counter to who we are as a people. And it's a violation of the basic tenets on which this nation was founded. I believe that gay couples deserve the same legal rights as every other couple in this country.
Hi, this is Tim from Moriel TV and Moriel Radio here with James Jacob Prasch. I'm in California and Jacob's in England, and this is This Week in Prophecy.
Blessings in Jesus, dear friends. This week in prophecy, and as usual, quite a week it has been. We shall begin as we often do in the Middle East. Major events transpired this week that have been underreported in most mainstream media, specifically the fall of the Kirkuk oil-producing region and city in Kurdistan in northern Iraq. It has fallen to Iraqi government forces in response to electoral decisions supporting an independent Kurdistan that is obviously contested by Iran, by Turkey, and by the Iraqi government. Kurdistan would be landlocked. It would not have a good pipeline route other than the one through Turkey, which is inimical to it, and would create a number of problems for the Kurdish people indeed. Nonetheless, the unworkability of the Iraqi government and the continual plight of the Turkish people who are ethnically Kurds has stirred up a nationalism that is almost an act of desperation because there's nothing else workable. As we have stated repeatedly, the Kurds are the descendants of the ancient Medes who were friendly to Israel, and they're probably the only people in Iraq who the United States and the West and Israel can at all trust. You cannot trust the rest of them. The fall of Kirkuk, however, is not a victory for the government of Iraq. It is a proxy victory for Iran. As we have been warning what is taking place, just as the Obama administration left a gap that was filled by ISIS when he removed American forces, even the remaining 10,000 that would have been necessary to prevent the vacuum from being filled by ISIS, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, and John Kerry presented snatching defeat from the jaws of victory. The surge had worked. Iraq was stable until along came Barack Obama and destabilized it, creating his vacuum filled by his JV team. And the rest is history. Once more, we're in danger of the same thing happening again. Mr. Trump has fulfilled his campaign promise and destroyed ISIS. It has been eradicated. Its last stronghold, Raqqa, has fell, and it is now obliterated. It has, however, scattered, and this has created problems. You have forces that are not simply al-Qaeda now, but that are ISIS-linked as far afield as Libya and into Niger, aligning themselves with Boko Haram, resulting in the killing of 5 American special forces. This was problematic because the operations in Niger were semi-covert against ISIS and against Boko Haram. When airstrikes or air support was called in, which was provided in cooperation with the French Air Force, the French could not drop bombs on the terrorist positions because the United States is barred from offensive action in Niger. The whole thing was a quagmire, sending troops into a combat zone with their hands tied behind their back, and 5 of them are coming home dead now. This is the situation. The gloves have to come off. But America does not learn the lessons of history. Much the same as it sent troops into combat in Vietnam with their hands tied behind their back, they're repeating their same penchant for doing the same thing. And we have 5 Americans in body bags. Once ISIS is destroyed in Iraq, they are essentially splintering far afield, even into the Sahel and Africa. Let us continue. This situation in northern Iraq profits nobody but Iran and Russia, and Iran's efforts to send its tentacles as far west as into Lebanon, uniting again with Hezbollah as an operational force against Israel. This has been the reality. Iran is, of course, aligned with Russia in backing the forces of Assad in Syria. This week in prophecy, Israeli Air Force jets were on routine patrol monitoring Hezbollah operations in Lebanon, and they came under anti-aircraft fire from batteries inside Syria. So it was Syrian anti-aircraft batteries firing on Israeli planes that were flying over Lebanon, not Syria. The Israelis, however, responded and attacked the batteries inside Syria. The Israeli planes bombed Syria. Again, this was downplayed in the international media. In fact, most of it was almost ignored. But it does show us what is beginning to take place. Much the same as Mr. Obama created ISIS as a viable force that he told us was a JV team, when in fact it was attacking San Bernardino, California, Paris, France, Brussels, Belgium, etc. The Trump administration is in danger of doing the same thing. Their concords with Mr. Putin have not worked. It is essential now. It is essential that now that ISIS has been dismembered in northern Iraq and is largely dysfunctional and is fragmenting, that restrictions on American offensive operations in places like Libya and Niger not be restricted. The gloves must come off. More importantly, however, now that ISIS has been leveled, the next target needs to be Iranian military personnel in Iraq and Syria. The American and Israeli air forces need to attack the Iranians in Syria and in Iraq, and do so quickly. They need to obliterate them from the air, inflicting as many casualties as possible. The Trump administration should also move to label the Iranian Republican Guard as a terrorist organization. Nonetheless, what you're going to have now in Iraq is a vacuum filled by Iran, much the same as Obama created a vacuum filled by ISIS. We will simply be exchanging one evil for another. That is the shape things are presently taking this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, the Provincial Assembly in Quebec has imitated France and moved to restrict facial coverings in public facilities and transport. This obviously would affect fundamentalist Muslims most pointedly. They are, of course, protesting, seeking to mount legal and political challenges. We applaud the actions of the legislature in Quebec, as we do in France. We need to restrict Islamic dress when that dress prevents monitoring of facial images of Muslims as a necessary component in the war against terror. Not that we are saying all Muslims are terrorists, but most terrorists are Muslims. There needs to be facial recognition by security, camera devices, etc. in public places and facilities, and to use religion to hide their faces from being identified when they may be suicide bombers or terrorists is simply unacceptable. We applaud what was done in France. We hope it is done elsewhere, and we certainly agree with the actions in Quebec. Unfortunately, the left-wing government of Justin Trudeau may not agree, but that is what is going on in Canada this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, a new political trend is underway legislatively within the Knesset in Israel. This follows the Halamesh terrorist murders of 3 family members that have spiked a call for readdressing laws on capital punishment of murderers. The law allowing for capital punishment technically exists, but it is not normally applied. It is greatly restricted legally in the name of being a liberal, civilized country. The one time that it was not suspended but applied was in the case of Adolf Eichmann. There is a move afoot by certain Israeli legislators, members of the Knesset, led by Nava Boca, to allow for the execution of Islamic terrorists who murder Israeli civilians. While we applaud the principle of this, obviously the international community would be up in arms about it. It is a much better policy to shoot Muslim terrorists dead on sight. No trial, no questions, just kill them where they are. Not summary executions. You don't give them the chance to surrender. You assume they're a suicide bomber or they have a weapon, and you shoot them dead and kill them where they are, the way you would do in any other combat zone. the way if you met them on a battlefield in Iraq or Syria or Lebanon or anywhere else, you treat them the same way. You simply shoot them dead as if they were an armed combatant. It doesn't matter, male, female, just shoot them dead immediately, unless they are children, in which case other considerations may come into place. The problem being that fundamentalist Islamists groom their children to be suicide bombers with the promise of 72 virgins. You can't even treat the children as immune from being shot dead on sight. This is not summary execution. It is not capital punishment being carried out without trial. It is simply a matter of facing the fact that it is urban combat, that counterterror is a combat situation. It is not a police situation. Although I agree with the principle and the spirit of executing these terrorists, even the fact that the Israelis will sometimes exchange hundreds, even thousands, for one captured Israeli soldier. For one. Given that fact, the international outcry against Israel will be horrific, as if Israel were guilty of genocide for killing murderers. Nonetheless, that is the reality. We believe that counterterror should not be treated anywhere, not in Israel, not in the United States, as a police situation or a police hostage situation. It should be treated as a battlefield military scenario where the terrorists are identified as combatants and shot dead immediately, no questions asked, as they would be on a battlefield. This is our view, although we do agree with the spirit of the law. Terrorists are taking advantage of Israel's refusal to apply its capital execution provisions within its body of law. They simply say, we can kill Israelis, but they won't kill us. We'll be held in prison until we're exchanged for a captured Israeli soldier. This must be put to an end. But the best way to put an end to it is with a bullet in the head of a terrorist, not with negotiation. You cannot deal with people who do not behave as humans, as if they have human rights. Once a fundamentalist Muslim behaves in a subhuman manner, in an animalistic manner, they must be dealt with as if they were an animal with rabies. I'm not saying that they're animals with rabies, but they have reduced themselves to the behavior of one. They will kill children. They will butcher Israeli soldiers and eat their organs and have photographs of themselves taken with the blood coming out of their mouths. The only way to deal with a rat with rabies is to kill it. You don't negotiate with it. This situation is untenable, where Muslim terrorists know the Israelis will not execute them if they're captured, and they'll be exchanged at some future point for one Israeli soldier, hundreds of them, sometimes more. This must end. These terrorists must be killed. Forget about it in terms of a juridical proceeding. Forget about it in terms of a police hostage situation. Treat it as a battlefield situation. That is the only way to deal with it. Not in police terms, in military terms. Not in juridical terms of criminal law, but in terms of military law. According to the Geneva Convention, you are allowed to kill enemy combatants. That's the simple way it goes. Attempts to surrender and so forth, you've got to assume they may be suicide bombers. You can find some legal way to take them out of the game. Let us continue. This week in prophecy. Again, the problem becomes NATO. NATO, indeed, because of Turkey. NATO was established in 1949 to defend the West and Western values against Soviet communist aggression. Turkey was at that time a member of NATO. Turkey, established by Ataturk, wanted to have an Eastern culture and religion, but it wanted to have a Western economy and democracy, sort of like what MacArthur built for Japan after the Second World War. They would have their Shinto religion, they would have their Eastern culture, but they would be a Western economy, industrialized with a Western democracy. That was the original vision for Turkey, and to a degree it happened. Now there is a resurgent Islamic Turkish nationalism under Recep Erdogan. Far from defending Western values, Turkey is against Western values. One poll in the mid-2000s said that most Turks see the United States as the primary threat to global peace. Yet most Turks said that if Turkey was in trouble, they would expect the United States to come to Turkey's defense. This simply does not work. In the meantime, for fear of the Turkish human rights activist based in the United States, who lives in the Pocono Mountains in eastern Pennsylvania, I speak of Fethullah Gulen, there has been a human rights abuse avalanche perpetrated by the Erdogan government in Turkey. 50,000 people, many of them teachers and so forth, have lost their jobs. Westernized Turks, modernists, those who are pro-democracy, 110,000 have lost their jobs. 50,000 have been arrested. 50,000 have been arrested by this present regime. Far from defending Western values, Turkey is now opposed to Western values. With the collapse of the Soviet Union, no fewer than 3 NATO Secretary Generals stated that radical Islamic fundamentalism is as much a threat to the West as Sovietism ever was. Turkey is now what NATO needs to defend itself from. It is only the politics of what is happening in Syria and the fear of it falling into some kind of an alignment with Russia that is the political factor preventing people from calling the proverbial spade a spade. With this happening, remember, Mr. Putin could care less about democracy and democratic values. His own goddaughter is running against him in Russian elections. Not that that's going to make any difference. What we are seeing, again, is the scale tipping towards a potential alignment of Turkey and Russia. One week it leans one way, the next week it leans the other way. Last week, the Turkish accumulation of forces on the border with Syria was something that was hostile to the political aims of Mr. Putin. Yet the overall gravitation of these events is for a rapprochement between Turkey and Russia that could lead to a Gog and Magog scenario. Again, we are speculating, but we need to watch these events carefully as they unfold. This week in prophecy. This week in prophecy to the UK. The British MI5 has warned that it is stretched to the max with over 500 counterterrorism investigations and sting operations underway. They have foiled 20 terrorist plots, but there are others they were unable to foil on London Bridge, the Blackfriars, and in front of the Houses of Parliament. While the mayor of London, a Muslim, basically says, get used to it. It's a part of life in a big city in the modern world. Islamic terror is something that people in the West are expected to get used to, according to the Muslim mayor of London. Again, in many respects, Great Britain is losing its mind. How could such a diabolical person be the mayor of London? Not because he's a Muslim, but because of what he says about Islamic terror. These people pretend to be moderates. But when you look at their actions and you examine their words carefully, you cannot say that they're moderates. Because Islamic terror is commonplace in the Islamic world, why should it be commonplace in London, or in Paris, or in Munich? But according to a judge in Honolulu, it should be commonplace in Honolulu, in Chicago, in Los Angeles, and in New York. The liberal agendaist judges, again, usurping the power of the executive branch and circumvention of the Constitution, have ruled against Mr. Trump, saying it was discriminatory against Muslims, even though his ban includes non-Muslim countries such as Venezuela. Again, we have corrupt judges legislating from the bench who need to be impeached and removed. Radical Islam, from Israel to the United States to Europe, to Great Britain, to Australia, takes advantage of our democratic and constitutional freedoms and our laws designed to protect civil rights and human rights, and exploits those to deprive us of those rights, and they do so with the help of liberal politicians and liberal judges. This is the judgment of God. We've warned and warned and warned. Islam is God's instrument of judgment against the backslidden Judeo-Christian Western world. Israel, America, Australia, Britain, Europe, we are all under the judgment of God for turning against our Judeo-Christian heritage. Yet, when this happened in Scripture, and God used the Assyrians and the Babylonians to correct his own people, he first said what was going to happen to the Assyrians and Babylonians, as in Jeremiah 51. The judgment of God is going to be poured out mercilessly on the Muslim world for its persecution of Arab, Iranian, and Asian Christians, African Christians, and for their hatred of Israel and the Jews. In the meantime, they have collaborators in the corridors of power in Whitehall and in Washington. Traitors in our own midst, Menlauses, Benedict Arnolds sitting on benches in courts saying that they're judges. This week in prophecy. Let us continue looking at Great Britain. Balliol College, Oxford University, has banned the Christian Union from having a display table at the welcoming event known as the Fresher, or the Fresher welcome event at the college for new students. It will not allow the Christian Union to display a table welcoming Christian students to join the Christian Union. They made it clear that there has been no accusations of discriminatory policies or practices by the Christian Union. It's just that some other Christians somewhere they see as discriminatory against homosexuals and lesbians for their opposition to same-sex marriage, homosexual adoption, and so forth. So therefore, these Christians in the Christian Union, who they admit did nothing, are going to be banned from having a table at the Fresher welcome for freshman students. They would not dare do that to the Islamic Students Union. And in the Islamic Students Union, you can plainly show discriminatory practices inherent in Sharia and Islamic law against Christians, against homosexuals, against women. But they wouldn't dare do it with Islam, only with Christians. Again, the hypocrisy and stupidity of the left. Oxford University was founded by Christians. It played a pivotal role in the Reformation. It was built on Judeo-Christian scriptural principles. But now the Christian Union is forbidden from having a display table at the Fresher welcome for new students. You can have the homosexual and lesbian one, you can have the Islamic one, but you can't have the Christian one. Jesus said, "You'll be hated by all nations for my name's sake." May the Lord intervene, and may his judgment be swift. I would rather see these idiotic people be saved, but it's very unlikely that's going to happen based on Romans chapter 1. God has given them over. This week in prophecy, back to Israel. New archaeological find underneath the ruins of Wilson's Arch at the Kotel, the Wailing Wall Plaza, and the entrance foyer to the Rabbi's Tunnel. Described in Josephus, a mini amphitheater has been located. This reaffirms the historicity of Josephus' descriptions of Jerusalem, and it reaffirms the historicity of the Judaic presence there. The amphitheater, situated at the Kotel, under Wilson's Arch, or the ruins of Wilson's Arch, described in the ancient historical references, found this week, says one thing and tells one story. The UNESCO organization says another. The Jews have no historical claim to that property. Now, obviously, it would have been built by Herod the Great, a Jewish king, even though it was a Roman architectural design. Archaeology says one thing, UNESCO says another. There is nothing educational, scientific, or cultural about UNESCO. It is a garbage organization, and we again applaud President Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu for withdrawing from it. We should not pay one penny for that despicable, unprincipled organization. It is not about education, science, or culture. It is simply another political vehicle for the Islamic bloc of 57 Muslim countries in the UN, the largest bloc in the UN. This week in prophecy. Let us continue. This week in prophecy, an excellent article has appeared by Philip Carl Salzman, published in the UK and in the USA, on the impossibility of peace in the Middle East. Written from an anthropological and historical perspective, he highlights something that has been known and recognized, but he brings it center stage. Anyone who has lived in the Islamic world, particularly the Arab world, but also Iran and other places, understands something. It is true in Africa. It is true in the Middle East. It is true in much of Asia. Nationalism, in the Western sense of the word, meaning patriotism, is non-existent in the Western sense. Loyalty is to a family, tribe, or clan. For instance, Saudi Arabia. Loyalty to Saudi Arabia is not loyalty to that nation. It is loyalty to the House of Saud, which had a jihad against a rival house, a rival clan, a rival family. That was the family of the former king Musharraf, who was the rightful king of Saudi Arabia. Now the Salafists are in control. This is the reality. We see this in Jordan with the Palestinians, 70% of the population. Their loyalty is to that. Their loyalty is not to the Hashemite government of King Abdullah II, by and large. The Bedouins are loyal to him. Iraq, the same. You have the Sunni tribes. You have the Kurds in the north. Then in the south, you have those tribes whose political sympathies lean towards Iran because they are Shia. This is much the same as what happened in Africa. Let's understand what he has said, but broaden it. And again, his article was excellent. In his article, he brings out the following theme, and he's absolutely correct. Salzman contends that the values of people in the Middle East are not primarily to the causes of peace or justice or national sovereignty. More important to them is loyalty to the clan, family, or tribe. Considerations of justice. Consideration in the juridical sense of justice. The quest for peace. Those things are subordinated to loyalty to the clan, to the tribe. This is likewise true in post-colonial Africa. The European powers, pre-World War I, determined that the only way to rule the world, at least much of it, to rule the Middle East and Africa and areas of Asia, was by colonial empires controlled from civilized countries in Europe, Britain and France, and others to a lesser degree. In the post-colonial era, after World War I in the Middle East, and in the collapse of the British and French empires after the Second World War, the tribal cultures and peoples of the Middle East reverted back to their tribalism. And Africa, likewise, they reverted back to their tribalism. These nations, as we've said before, like Syria and Lebanon and Jordan, are the creations of the British and French. Iraq is the creation of the British. Most of these countries in Africa are the creations of the British and French. A national model of social organization, economy, and polity doesn't work in a tribal mentality and a tribal culture. Hence, we have the quagmire of Africa and the quagmire of the Middle East and of much of Asia. An excellent article, but I wish he would write a sequel to it, expanding along the lines I've just explained, and its relationship to colonialism and post-colonialism, not only in the Middle East and in Africa, but a very well done article by Philip Carl Salzman this week. Melanie Fellowes has also published an excellent article in Great Britain. She was focusing on the dangers of the heavy water reactor at Arak in Iran, and the clear and present danger of Iran developing a nuclear arsenal with fissionable material that can be mounted on missiles, and how quickly it can happen. Yet the political left and the mainstream media are saying the problem is not Iran or even North Korea, but rather, in their obsession, Donald Trump. Again, the insanity of the left has once again been well documented and well presented by none other than Melanie Fellowes. God bless her. I hope she comes to a saving faith in Jesus. Now let me say this. I do not hate Arabs by any means. I love Arabs. I love Arab Christians. They are Abraham's children. The finest believers in Jesus I've met have been people saved out of Islam. I've led Muslims to Christ. I've led Iranian Muslims to Christ, Shia Muslims to Christ. It has been a tremendous blessing in my life. I do not hate these people. I would far prefer for them to be saved. But I'm also a realist. If it's their life or ours, self-defense is not a sin. You must recognize the enemy for what he is, and he is not a JV team. He's extremely vicious and extremely dangerous. You do not think twice about pulling the trigger when you're face to face, eyeball to eyeball, with a rabid rat. That is what their mentality is. Moderate Muslims are murdered by these people all the time, but their real target is to murder Jews and Christians, Westerners. Let us continue this week in prophecy. The process of rapprochement, allegedly, that is likely to in some way break down between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority is continuing this week. But once again, former Hamas leader Khalid Mashal from Gaza, who was responsible for the negotiations with Mahmoud Abbas, has made his own presidential ambitions public once again. It is not unthinkable there could be a power play for Hamas to get control of the Palestinian Authority, even though at the moment the Palestinian Authority has the upper hand economically and a degree of backing from the Israelis, the Americans, and the West. If a Hamas takeover was to take place of the Palestinian Authority, this would not be acceptable to Israel. It would not be acceptable to the USA, and it would not be acceptable more than likely to Jordan. Watch this space. Watch Khalid Mashal if he opposes Mahmoud Abbas for the leadership in a reunited Palestinian Authority with the rapprochement with Hamas. But that is what is taking place this week in prophecy. This week in prophecy, Prime Minister Rosh HaMemshala Benjamin Netanyahu spoke out about something few other people are speaking out about: the plight of Middle East Christians. He decried Western leaders for not speaking out on what has happened to Middle East Christians. He has said that they are remaining silent, but he will not remain silent. We are reminded that Israel took the Christian refugees from southern Lebanon, driven out by Iran-backed Hezbollah. We are reminded that Israel even took Christian refugees from as far away as southern Sudan. We are reminded that Israel is the only Western democracy in the Middle East where the human rights and civil rights of Arab Christians are protected by law. A recent unfortunate terrorist attack on a Catholic church at the Sea of Galilee, which may have been carried out by Muslims, we don't know who did it, was decried by Mr. Netanyahu and by Israel's president. Again, that would not happen in most Muslim countries. The Israeli government said it was an attack on all Israelis, much the same as the radical Islamic attacks in the Middle East are focused against Christians, but the world remains silent. The world tries to remain silent about the fact that Israel is the opposite. When the Baptist house in Jerusalem was twice burned, the Israeli government came to their aid financially and made a legal war, launching criminal investigations of the Jewish Defense League's Israel branch, called Kach, founded by the late Rabbi Maya Kahane. The Israeli government took legal and police action to protect Christians from radical Jews and from radical Muslims. It is the only country in the Middle East that has this policy. It is a shame and a disgrace that there are not Christian leaders, or at least leaders of Christianized countries, speaking out on the plight of Christians in Muslim countries. Thank God that Israel does. And thank God that Israel is the one country in the Middle East protecting the human rights and civil rights of Arab Christians. This week in prophecy. Let us continue. The Arab Gulf states, this week in prophecy, have been united in voicing their approval of President Trump's actions in decertifying Iran, knocking the ball into the court of Congress. But again, we see the swamp rat of swamp rats, New York Senator Chuck Schumer, a Jewish senator from New York who is the Senate Minority Leader. He opposed Obama's false peace deal with Iran. He opposed the actions of Hillary Clinton, of John Kerry, and Barack Obama. He thought it was inimical to the United States. He thought it was hostile to the interests of Israel and to the moderate Muslim countries, so-called, in the Persian Gulf. He opposed Obama as a Democrat. But now that President Trump has decertified that very agreement that Mr. Schumer opposed, Mr. Schumer has flipped, and he is opposing Mr. Trump for agreeing with him. The hypocrisy of a politician like Dirty Chuck Schumer knows no limits. He'll sell Israel down the river. He'll sell America down the river. He has no loyalty to anything or anyone except his own political interests. He opposed this agreement. And when Mr. Trump, agreeing with him, decertifies it, now he flips. Again, one can watch film clips of Barack Obama in 2008 opposing same-sex marriage, and of Hillary Clinton opposing same-sex marriage, and of Hillary Clinton defending the Second Amendment. But as soon as the political tide changes and it's not in their interest, they completely flip, as if they always were in favor of same-sex marriage or always opposed the Second Amendment. They just lie. This is 1984 type revisionism. It is newspeak. That is what the mainstream media is. It's what the Democratic Party is. It's what politicians like Hillary Clinton and Barack Obama are. But right now, summa cum laude, it is Chuck Schumer. Again, we've warned, he's a Menelaus to the Jewish people. He is a Benedict Arnold. This week in prophecy. Well, what a week it has been. Many of these things have happened and are continuing to happen. But finally, we have the striking case of a member of the Israeli parliament from the liberal left wing. Remember, Israel is a microcosm of the Western world. They have fake news. They have a lunatic left. They have all the things you have in the United States. One of their spokesmen is Marav Misheli, a radical Israeli feminist politician, a member of the Knesset, again from the left-wing Labour Party. She appeared on Australia TV, in which she denounces the nuclear family as the least safe family model for children. Having a father and a mother, a mommy and a daddy, is the least safe family model for children, she says. Now, all the statistics show single-parent families, the havoc that wreaks, and the statistical predisposition of children born out of wedlock to drop out of school, to wind up in the criminal justice system. The statistical evidence is overwhelming. But you've got a feminist maniac in Israel, the same as you have feminist maniacs in the United States. Of course, this sets her in opposition to those holding to traditional values, the Orthodox Jews. It's unbelievable. She seeks to be an international voice for radical feminism and the destruction of the family. The feminist movement, as we've said, has lost its mind. You have Linda Saucer, a radical Muslim, defending Sharia despite its oppression, unbelievable oppression of women, and she calls herself a feminist. And she says you cannot be a feminist and not oppose Israel. Yet Jewish feminists will still come listening to her speak. There is no euphemism for this kind of idiocy. As Michael Savage correctly stated in his book, liberalism is a form of mental illness. Now, again, I don't want to politically pontificate. Our purpose is to look at these things from a prophetic agenda. But much the same as Satan is trying to destroy the Church of Jesus Christ with moral compromise on same-sex marriage and things of this nature, even in evangelical circles, using people like Tony Campola and other instruments of the devil to destroy traditional biblically based values. Steve Chalk in Britain, etc. So too, Satan has a plan to achieve the same with the people of God, Israel and the Jews. On one hand, you have the false Judaism of the rabbis, rabbinism, Talmudic Judaism, rejecting its own Messiah and replacing the authority of Scripture with rabbinic tradition. But in opposition to them, supposedly opposition, you have these radical Israeli feminists and ultraliberals. But they both serve the same master. Ultimately, however, the God of Israel will indeed have his victory. What a week it has been. That has been This Week in Prophecy. My name is James Jacob Prasch, speaking to you this week from merry old England. God bless, and please tell someone about Jesus this week. One last thing. My political views are my own. I am not trying to misrepresent them as a scriptural position or a theological position for the Christian church. They are simply my own comments. But the prophecies, the prophetic material, the prophetic significance of what's happening with Russia and Turkey, the moral breakdown of society, and the conflagration of events in the Middle East, these things are not my own views. They are what is predicted in Scripture, and they give us one message: Jesus is coming soon. Let us prepare the way for that to happen by telling people about him and his salvation while there is still time. Thank you for listening. God bless.